When I was 13, my father, Bob Enyart, debated notorious Calvinist James White at the Brown Palace in downtown Denver. It was a magnificent venue. Little old me was just beginning to wrestle with these ideas, and biased as I was convinced that what James White was saying did not make sense.
So you agree that eternally past, God the Son only had one nature.
Of course.
And today, God the Son has two natures.
That's correct.
And so you don't think that's a change?
No.
The debate at points got heated, and I was instantly drawn to the topic: open theism versus Calvinism. My father had always taught open theism, but I was never too interested in the topic until James White started throwing everything he had at my dad. He said that my dad responded with
ad hominem, dishonesty, misrepresentation. It's really bad. Really, really bad.
And then he immediately followed that up by saying,
demonstration of cultic mindset, because Bob Enyart is a cult leader. He has a little cult going. It's a non-Christian group. It really is. And, finite Godism has never been a Christian belief, never will be a Christian belief. It's good to analyze how he can be corrected in things, and in one ear, out the other, no connection whatsoever. It helps to explain the Joseph Smiths and the Judge Rutherfords and the Russells of the world. We still have cults being started today, so it's good to be able to recognize that kind of thing.
Which was fascinating to me. I saw my dad devote his life to preaching the gospel, to pro-life activism. He got thrown in jail for preaching the gospel. He preached the gospel in jail, and then when he got out, he kept preaching the gospel. He was an avid defender of the Bible as our highest authority. He was an avid defender of the Trinity, of young earth biblical creationism. He did a tremendous amount of work exposing the cults like Jehovah's Witnesses and Mormons and Catholics, and he was a guy who taught that we were saved by grace through faith alone, not of works, lest any man should boast. I've studied cults myself at great length, and my dad certainly didn't seem to meet any of the criteria of a cult leader. And here, James White was calling my dad a cult leader. That was 10 years ago. My father has since passed. He was martyred for his pro-life activism, and this debate is in the rearview mirror. I've never quite forgotten about it, nor lost interest in the topic. Since then, I've spent a great deal of time studying both open theism and Calvinism, and I find it ironic that James White was the one who sparked my interest in studying open theism. In fact, James White is the man who made me reject Calvinism. That brings us to today. My father was a pastor passionate about open theism, and that torch has been passed on to me. I carry his passion. Why? Why would I be passionate about such a niche theological issue? There are four primary reasons. Each one is more important than the last. I've spent about 3 weeks prepping this video, and the reasons I'm going to present, they build on one another. And I think the more you watch, the more you will start to like some of these ideas. Number 4. Open theism is the only Christian doctrine that allows for a true relationship between God and man, as it is the only theology that shows God is affected by man. The Bible describes God as our Heavenly Father 170 times. The analogy of a father is a relational one. Under open theism, that comes to life. Think about your own earthly father. Fathers, they love their children. They would die for their children. They would sacrifice everything for their children. They would want what's best for their children if they were loving fathers. But it's not just a one-way street. The father is also affected by his children. He is moved to joy if his children love him, respect him, and obey him. On the flip side, he is grieved and saddened when his children reject him, disobey him, and disrespect him. It is a two-way street where both parties affect the other, and this is how the Bible describes our relationship with God. As his children, we have an obligation to serve him and to submit to him and align our wills with his. But it also describes the reverse, where God, the creator, is affected by his creation. He interacts with us and is moved by us. He is either touched by our faithfulness or hurt by our rejection of him. And only open theism provides this two-way dynamic relationship. Other Christians describe God as immutable and impassible, meaning he is not changed or touched by his creation, but rather they describe him as stagnant and emotionally cold. This is unbiblical. Many Christians describe God as immutable and impassible, but these are the descriptions of a fake stone idol. Stone idols, they don't change. You see a stone idol, it just sits there, it doesn't change. The golden calf that Moses smashed was like this. It was impassible. It was emotionless, emotionally dead, emotionally unable to respond even to the people that were worshiping it. This is how the Bible, impassible and immutable, describes these false stone lowercase g gods, not the true biblical triune God. The Bible describes God as the living God 30 different times. In the Old Testament, 15 times. In the New Testament, 15 times. And living people, they change and they are affected by others. God is truly affected by his people. One of my favorite examples is found in the story of Exodus. God is burning hot in his anger against Israel because of the golden calf. And then we read in Exodus 32, and the Lord said to Moses, I have seen this people, and indeed it is a stiff-necked people. Now therefore, let me alone that my wrath may burn hot against them, and I may consume them. And I will make of you, Moses, a great nation. Then how does Moses respond? Does he respond by saying, oh God, you are unchanging and stagnant? Or does he respond like an open theist who thinks God is capable of changing his mind? Well, let's read on. Then Moses pleaded with the Lord his God and said, Lord, why does your wrath burn hot against your people, whom you have brought out of the land of Egypt with great power and with a mighty hand? Why should the Egyptians speak and say, he brought them out to harm them, to kill them in the mountains, and to consume them from the face of the earth? Turn from your fierce wrath and relent of this harm to your people. Remember Abraham, Isaac, and Israel, your servants, to whom you swore by your own self and said to them, I will multiply your descendants as the stars of heaven. And all this land that I have spoken of, I give it to your descendants, and they shall inherit it forever. So Moses responds as an open theist who thinks God is able to change his mind. How then does God react to Moses' plea? Does he say, oh, pathetic man, I am the unchanging God. You can't change my mind. I'm still going to wipe out the people of Israel? Or does he actually change his mind as an open theist might expect? Well, let's continue reading. Exodus 32:14. So the Lord repented from the harm which he said he would do to his people. God was affected by a man. He was affected by Moses. Some will respond and say, well, this was God's plan all along. Even if Moses didn't, give this plea to God, God still would not have destroyed them. But this is refuted by Psalm 106:23, which states, quote, therefore he said that he would destroy them, had not Moses, his chosen one, stood before him in the breach to turn away his wrath, lest he destroy them. So God was genuinely affected by Moses, which is only possible under open theism. Other theologies like Calvinism teach that this was all along the eternal plan of God, when the text clearly shows that it wasn't. The plans of God were changed by Moses. And this makes prayer way more meaningful when we know God doesn't just affect us, but we affect him. Number 3, open theism makes it easier to share the gospel. Consider the tragic story of a 14-year-old girl who gets raped. It's traumatizing. It's the worst thing that could happen to someone. And then say that this 14-year-old girl went to a church to seek help. What do Christians so often say? They say the single most damaging thing that they could possibly say. They say, we don't know why God is doing this to you, but we have to trust him. His ways are higher than our ways. And this is the worst thing that you could possibly say. Why? Well, because it teaches that little girl the most evil lie imaginable, that God wanted you to be raped. And that is not true. That is in no way true. God did not explicitly want her to be raped. He did not have a hidden desire for her to be raped. He didn't even have a faint hope that she would be raped. But that is what Christian people, what we say to people when they're hurting. And it's wrong. God does not want people to be raped in any sense of the word. I mentioned that my dad, he was martyred. He was murdered for being a pro-life activist. I had so many Christians tell me, we don't know why God is doing this, but we have to trust him. And that is beyond ridiculous. It is, they unknowingly blame God for murdering my father. And this is the Calvinism that has seeped into Christianity, and it needs to be rejected. It needs to be confronted. It has serious eternal consequences, right? Imagine that same 14-year-old girl who was raped. Imagine her hearing this from James White.
When a child is raped, is God responsible, and did he decree that rape?
If he didn't, then that rape is an element of meaningless evil that has no purpose. What I'm trying to point out by going to Scripture...
So what is your answer there? Because I want to understand the answer to that question.
I'm trying to go to Scripture to answer.
Yes, but what is the answer to the question that he just asked so that we can understand what the answer is?
I mentioned to him, yes, because if not, then it's meaningless and purposeless. And though God knew it was going to happen, he created without a purpose.
That girl who was raped, who heard that teaching, would undoubtedly blame God for her rape. And it would be because of James White's false teaching. That is the danger of Calvinism. Why am I so passionate about open theism? I'm passionate more about the gospel, and open theism answers so many skeptics' objections like this. Why is God doing this to me? Why did God make me be raped? The open theist can say, he's not. He didn't do that. That was the rapist who did that, not God. We can appeal to free will. I've spent so much of my time witnessing to unbelievers, and I've been so discouraged to hear them respond by arguing against Calvinism, not against Christianity, against Calvinism. And so much valuable time has been wasted because Calvinists have misrepresented God. Other Christians, mainly Calvinists, they teach that every single wicked thought, every single wicked deed existed first and foremost in the mind of God before he even created us. All wickedness flows from the mind of God under Calvinism. Under Calvinism, God in eternity past, he decreed every sin that man would ever commit down to the atom, down to the molecule, down to the most minute details. God did it, and he did it for his glory. In John Calvin's Institutes, he has a chapter titled No Mere Permission, in which he argues that sin is not just permitted by God, but that God is actively the author of it. He claims that, quote, it seems absurd that man should be blinded by the will and command of God and yet be forthwith punished for his blindness. And so he admits that Calvinism seems absurd, his word, not mine, and then argues we should believe it anyways. Then Calvin's conclusion in the same chapter, speaking of sin, he claims, we infer that God was the author. If you think I'm taking this out of context, I encourage you to go check it out. The context makes it much worse. When Calvin described his own theology as absurd, he was correct. In John 9:41, Jesus said to them, if you were blind, you would have no sin. But now you say, we see, therefore your sin remains. So Calvinism shows that God is the author of sin. Even our friend James White said that God decrees child rape. And if this is your belief, you cannot justify Christianity. Under Calvinism, you must teach that what John himself described as absurd. You have to teach that. And how in the world are we as Christians going to preach the gospel when it has been so severely twisted and perverted? God is the essence of righteousness and goodness. There is no darkness in him, and preaching the gospel simply does not work if you believe that God decreed child rape. It simply doesn't work. If a Calvinist were to be consistent and were to preach this to the lost, the unbelievers who would be listening to him would think, this guy is nuts. He's absurd. And if you're thinking, oh, Dominic, you should agree with them just to put on a united front, I'll remind you of what Paul said in Romans 3:8, right? Paul was, he would point to unbelievers who were turned off by Christians doing and saying dumb things. And what did Paul say in Romans 3:8? He said, their condemnation is just. He would point to unbelievers and say they're criticizing what they think of Christianity, and they're correct because you have misrepresented Christianity. Now, oddly enough, you will hear Calvinists say things like, he's the author, but that doesn't mean God is guilty. He's the author of sin, but he's not guilty of it. Or, oh, he decreed this, but he is not responsible. Or he decreed it, but he's not the author. Or God decreed this, but he didn't cause this, right? Essentially, they play word games, trying to get out of this uncomfortable spot. But no matter what word games they play, they're still in this horrible, horrible spot. To me, if you claim that God in any way decreed, ordered, authored, encouraged, desired, commanded, instituted, prescribed, enacted, preordained, mandated, caused, endorsed, prompted, promoted, compelled, predetermined, or in any way authored or wanted sin to ever occur, you have seriously hurt the character of God. I used a lot of words just now to preemptively get around the word games of the Calvinists. God never desired sin. He never decreed sin. He never authored sin. He never caused sin in any way, shape, or form. That is what I say as an open theist. But to a Calvinist, God decrees child rape. That's what James White agreed to so tragically. God authors sin. That's the word that John Calvin himself uses. We infer God is the author, right? And so this is evil theology that turns God into a monster. Now, some Calvinists, they will say, oh, God decrees sin, but he's somehow not evil, and we just don't understand it. That's what John Calvin said. At the very least, I'm thankful they don't believe God is evil, and they do believe that God is good, but they believe this not because of, but in spite of their Calvinism. And so when the Calvinists said, God decrees sin, but he remains holy, that's simply doublespeak. It's talking out of both sides of your mouth. It's a self-contradictory statement. It makes no sense, and I totally reject it. They might not like it, nor admit it, but Calvinism places the responsibility of sin on God's shoulders. It places guilt on God's shoulders. Open theism, however, recognizes that God has free will and he created us in his likeness. And as we were created in his likeness, we also have free will. And it is by our free will that we reject God and we do what is unholy and wicked. God does not cause us to be evil. He gave us free will and we've chosen to be evil. He does not author it. He does not decree it. He does not desire it or want it. But rather, open theism embraces the biblical understanding that God never desires this. He never wants us to sin. He never decreed us to sin. Rather, he is doing everything within his power to save a lost and dying world from our sin. Open theism solves the problem of evil by positing human free will as the cause of evil, not God. God is not the original source of evil. Rather, it is the fallen creation. Calvinists, they love to claim, oh, man has free will. Man does have free will, but then immediately contradict themselves by saying God decreed exactly what everyone would do, and down to the most minute molecules, and you cannot do anything other than what God decreed. I'm sorry, but in what way, in what world is that free will, right? Because free will is defined as the ability to do otherwise. As an open theist, I don't look at wickedness and try to figure out, okay, but how could this actually be a good thing? How could there be some meaning to this? But the Calvinist has to do that. I look at wickedness as an open theist, and I think, wow, that is purposeless evil. That is pure selfishness. That is pure rejection of God. I can't break it down and distill it any further than that. I can't dig any deeper. The core essence of sin is that it is selfishness. I don't need to unpack or discover anything more. That's all it is. Under Calvinism, all wickedness flows from the mind of God. And of course, they say that everything flows from the mind of God, so good things and bad things. And God is restraining evil. That's a thing Calvinists love to say. Yes, according to Calvinism, God is restraining evil, but he's ironically restraining the very evil that he decreed. That'd be like if you slashed someone's tires and then came and offered them new tires. You don't get any props for that. You broke it, and so then you fix it, yet you think you get to play the hero. No, God doesn't act that way. That's how lunatics act. And so to solve the problem of evil and many other problems relating to evangelism, open theists, we have the upper hand. James White himself, he said this.
Any theist other than an open theist has to deal with this particular issue. I think the provisionist, by losing the divine decree, doesn't have any meaningful response to any of this.
Number 2, God's free will. There is a major criticism of open theists because we believe that God exists within time. The criticism is, oh, you open theists, you put God in a box. But as we'll see, the reverse is true. What if I were to ask you, can God design a new butterfly? To the average Christian, the answer is yes. But to many more philosophical minds, the answer is no, because that would imply that God is learning or changing. Here's a clip from the Matt Slick, Will Duffy debate on Calvinism versus open theism, where this exact concept played out.
Is God free to design a new butterfly?
In what sense free?
In a sense of a butterfly he's never designed. Can he design a new butterfly?
We're
yes
coming
or no?
back to the same issue of what it means to be free to accomplish something. There's different senses in which the issue of freedom can apply. I've already explained it once.
I'm guessing
though.
I'm guessing though that my 9-year-old daughter comprehends this question. I'm trying to help everybody understand.
Well, that's nice.
Either God has the ability to design a new butterfly or he doesn't.
Okay. So in what sense are you saying, asking the question?
I'm asking it in the sense of a butterfly that he's never designed in his mind. Okay. Can he design a new butterfly?
How could there be anything in his mind he doesn't know of?
Are you saying he's designed all possible butterflies?
I believe he knows all things. So there is nothing in God's mind that he's not aware of. So there's nothing new that could come into existence.
Notice the difficulty that Matt had answering that simple question. Matt is claiming that God cannot bring anything new into existence. What is this if not putting God into a box? On the same note, Calvinism teaches that God is locked into his own decree. This has serious implications. It turns God into a liar. For example, in Matthew 26:53, when God was on the cross, he says, I could call down 12 legions of angels. But for the Calvinist, in the moment when Jesus said that, he could not have called down those angels. Why? Well, because clearly he didn't, and if he didn't, then clearly that wasn't part of his eternal decree. And since it was not part of his eternal decree, he couldn't do it. That's what Calvinism teaches. He could not have called down those angels. Calvinism trades away God's freedom and gets nothing in return. Calvinists are the Christians who teach that God can only do what he decreed, and he can do nothing outside of his own decree. It is the Calvinist who places God into a box, not the open theist. Ultimately, open theism is based not on man's freedom, but on God's freedom, on God's free will. Open theism is the Christian doctrine that God exists within time, that he is alive, eternally free, and inexhaustibly creative. Because God is free, the future must be unsettled and unestablished. Open theists affirm the obvious, that God can think a new thought, that he can write a new song, or even that he can design a new butterfly. Number 1. Open theism is biblical. While there is plenty of philosophy and external motivations for being an open theist, the main motivation for open theism is internal to Christianity, the Bible. Through and through, the Bible depicts God as acting in time, eternally free, alive, infinitely wise, and omnicompetent. If you go to the website godsfreewill.com/verses, you will get a list of open theist verses, and it is a long and extensive list with 33 different categories of verses that all support open theism. You should take a look. And if you'll note, at the bottom of that list, there's a link to a spreadsheet where those verses are tallied. And in our study as open theists, we have 593 unique verses that are directly related to and support open theism. 385 verses in the Old Testament, 208 verses in the New Testament. Of course, fully presenting open theism from the Bible would take way too long for a single video, and so I will just go through the most significant example. A core tenet of open theism is that God changes. Of course, not God's righteousness, that remains consistent forever. It is consistent yesterday, today, and forever. But aside from God's righteousness, he is a God of change. And not just does he change, but God underwent the greatest change. When God the Son, the second person of the Trinity, Jesus, he became flesh in John 1:14, that was such a significant change. It wasn't just an average everyday, oh, I'm changing this up. It was the single greatest change in the history of the cosmos. No other change in the cosmos, in the history of the cosmos, even comes close to God the Son taking on a human nature. For all eternity past, God the Son had one nature, a divine nature. And then through the incarnation, going into the future, eternally into the future, God the Son now has two natures, a divine nature and a human nature. Jesus has two natures, divine and human, and there has been no greater change in the history of the universe than this, than God becoming flesh. And it is at the heart of the gospel of Christ. God took on a human nature, which is an undeniable, unimaginable, world-shattering change. The Word became flesh. All other theologies are forced to say that God cannot change. This is such a strength of open theism, and it's a strength unique to open theism, that we can recognize obvious biblical truths, and we can read these texts and read them at face value without feeling the need to go explaining them away. Yes, God changed, and it was the single greatest change in the history of the cosmos. I'm saying that a lot to add emphasis to it. It's a very important point. We don't need to go to some obscure passage in one of the obscure chapters in one of the minor prophets, although I do love doing that. We don't need to go there, though, to prove open theism. We can go to the heart of the gospel to find open theism. God changed into a man. God changed into a man. That was a change. There are many examples of God changing, but this one is the most undeniable. Of course, God was not a man in the Old Testament for all eternity past, and now, after the incarnation, God is a man for all eternity future. This is clear. The immutability of God is a false doctrine. And where do we go to disprove this? We go to John chapter 1. Verse 1, "In the beginning was the Word, and the Word was with God, and the Word was God. And the Word became flesh and dwelt among us. And we beheld his glory, the glory as the only begotten of the Father, full of grace and truth." Obviously, that is a change. To be an open theist is to accept this, and to be a Calvinist is to reject the obvious biblical truth.
So you agree that eternally past, God the Son only had one nature.
Of course.
And today, God the Son has two natures.
That's correct.
And so you don't think that's a change?
No.
This is what you would call a master class in saying something confidently, even though you are clearly wrong, yet you hope that your confidence will make your opponent not see through it. But I do see through it, and to quote John Calvin, it seems absurd. I know open theism is largely disliked and there's a lot of hesitancy around it, but I'm really encouraged to see that it's growing. I plan on making more videos on the topic. I find that it really helps the Bible come to life. This video is simply an introduction of sorts. I know there are a lot of philosophical and biblical arguments against it, and I plan on covering those objections in the future. I'm sure you have some objections if you're watching this video and you're new to open theism. If you have some objections or concepts like how does open theism handle prophecy, or how does open theism handle Micah 3:6 or something like that, definitely let me know. Leave stuff like that in the comments. If I heart your comment, that means I plan on making a video about that or responding to that. And so make sure, if I heart your comment, make sure to subscribe for that. And as I make videos on open theism, I'll be putting them into this playlist. Make sure to check that out. I'll be answering a lot of objections, giving a lot of arguments for open theism. The more you watch, the more fun it's going to get. I can guarantee you that. Hey, today is a good day to honor and praise the Lord.